allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. We'll call the meeting to order. And I'll turn it over to the county manager.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today we are going to do the public procurement workshop, and I'd like to turn it over to Mary Tucker.
Good afternoon. Mary Tucker with the Procurement Management Department. Today we will provide a high overview of the public procurement process, including key principles, practices, and responsibilities involved in ensuring fair, effective, and procurement for the county. The purpose of public procurement is to ensure that the government agency spends taxpayers' dollars reasonably, effectively by acquiring goods and services through a competitive, transparent process. Each department identifies its own needs, whether it's replacing aging equipment, expanding services, or planning capital projects, which could be anything from computers to bridges. Although the department determines the need, everything over $100,000 still comes back to the board for their approval. Sometimes projects can come back to the board more than once. For example, Big Carlos Bridge. This project started in 2016 and it came back before the board 10 times. So the board does have input on everything that we do and approve it. When starting a procurement, we're often asked how to do one. Unfortunately, it is not one size fits all. We often answer it with "it depends." Public procurement can be a complex process shaped by wide ranges of laws, regulations, and internal processes. There's always 3 questions that we must ask prior to any solicitation. What is being purchased? What is the estimated budget? And what is the funding source? When the item or service is the same, sometimes when we buy things that are the same thing, it doesn't necessarily mean that we procure it the same way. It depends on the funding sources. They dictate what processes that we have to follow. Following proper procurement avoids legal challenges, loss of funding, project delays, even damaging. Before we get into some of the procurement rules, we want to go over the workload that procurement management did for fiscal year 2024-25. Last year, we managed over 2,000 contracts. We issued 336 solicitations. Currently, we have 109 in process. We issued 480 task orders, change orders, project authorizations, and project modifications. We issued almost 6,500 purchase orders. We set up over 1,000 new vendors last year, and we also almost processed 9,500 P-card charges. These numbers reflect the continued commitment and hard work of our team in supporting county operations and procurement needs effectively and efficiently. Let's take a look at our local procurement thresholds. These thresholds apply only if we are using local funds. If we are going to purchase a commodity, service, or construction and it's under $50,000, we're required to have 1 written quote. For a commodity and service between $50,000 and $250,000, we're required to have 3 written quotes. For construction from $50,000 to $300,000 is 3 written quotes. However, whenever we have a construction project that's estimated more than $200,000, we must publicly advertise that procurement, and we typically do that through an informal process. For commodities and services over $250,000, it is a formal solicitation. For construction over $300,000, that is also a formal solicitation. Again, these thresholds do not change what the board approval threshold is, which is still the $100,000. So any item over or any project over $100,000 must come back to the board. The state procurement thresholds are a little more complex, and they're distributed throughout the state statutes. There are two key ones that affect the county the most. One is for professional services, and these thresholds are statute defined and cannot be modified locally. I will go into greater detail over these in just a few slides. The other one, and most people may not know, is for electrical services. Any project over $75,000 must be a formal solicitation. Federal thresholds. As of October 1st, 2025, the federal thresholds have changed. However, until each federal agency adopts the new thresholds, we are required to follow the old ones. These are the old ones. Under $10,000 is required one written quote. From $10,000 to $250,000 requires 3 written quotes, and then anything over $250,000 is a formal solicitation. Please remember, when federal or commingling funds are used, procurement activities become significantly more complex, adding approximately 30% more to our workload due to increased documentation, compliance, and analysis requirements. There are several types of procurements. The 4 that we use the most are an invitation to bid. This is when we have a defined scope that we're using and we are able to award it to the lowest bidder. The other type, or another type that we use, is a request for proposal. This is based more on performance, and it also is awarded through best value, which could be price, their experience, their qualifications, a combination of things, and that criteria is set in the solicitation. Another popular method that is used is a piggyback contract. A lot of times the piggyback contracts that we use are nationwide, so that gives us a volume discount that's nationwide. Another thing that a piggyback does is it saves us time. For a piggyback, we can do one in about 5 weeks. For a formal solicitation, it takes us 4 to 6 months to issue one. The appropriate method is determined by the nature of the project, the funding source, and the required timelines. Each method serves a specific purpose and ensures compliance based on the situation. Now let's turn our attention to the procurement professional services. We issue a professional services contract through a RFP-CN, which stands for Request for Proposal, Competitive Negotiations. Anytime we're hiring engineers, architects, landscape architecture, surveying, and mapping, these are state statutes that we must follow and cannot be changed. There are 4 types of CNs that we do: design services, construction manager at risk, program management, and design build. Now, 2 of those, the design services and construction manager at risk, are all broken down further. What we are allowed to do is a continuing service library. The continuing service library, which is a pool of pre-qualified firms selected through a prior formal solicitation. This allows for a multiple award process where multiple firms will be awarded contracts for future use. But there is some requirements that go along with that continuing service contract. It is based on whether it's a study, and the study must be under $500,000, or if the construction is under $7.7 million, then we can pull from the continuing service contracts for design and construction. But please keep in mind, anytime we do a CN, they are hired based on their qualifications. We are not allowed to take price into consideration. Once we pick the most qualified, then we can negotiate the contract with them after that. For any projects that are over 500,000 or the construction is over 7.7 million, then we must do a formal solicitation. Please keep in mind that design, build, and program management is always a formal solicitation, no matter the cost. For RFPs and RFPCNs, when we receive the proposals, these are reviewed by an evaluation committee. The evaluation committee is subject to the Sunshine Law. That committee is made up of 5 committee members, 3 from the user department, 2 from additional departments that have a different assistant county manager. So we're encompassing 3 assistant county managers and at least 3 different departments. These committee members must have some type of experience in whatever the project is that they're going to be sitting on. The committee member is responsible for reviewing, scoring, and ultimately recommending a firm to the board for approval. Any questions? Timelines. From the time that the departments give a request to initiate to the procurement department, and we do what we need to do to get it to the board, these are the timelines that we give to the departments so that they can use these as planning purposes. It's important to note that actual durations may vary based on several factors, including the complexity of the project, the procurement requirements, the scope of negotiations that will need to be done. Each of the elements can impact the overall schedule, but these are what we use for planning purposes. There are 3 funding sources that the county has: local, state, and federal. When federal and state funding, there are various agencies underneath each of those. And with each of those agencies, specific requirements and compliance processes apply. Additional requirements could be independent cost estimates, price or cost analysis, Davis-Bacon, Section 3, Buy America, Build America, Buy America, and they are 2 separate things. Understanding the funding source is critical, as it determines which regulations and procurement protocols that must be followed throughout the project. Next, let's talk about an important topic that impacts every part of procurement and applies to everyone: conflict of interest. There are 2 types of conflict of interest. You have an individual conflict of interest. This would be where an employee has a financial or family or professional conflict in order for them to make a decision. An example of this would be is if the employee was on an evaluation committee and he owned part of the company that he was evaluating. This is unacceptable. This is a conflict of interest. Another conflict of interest would be an organizational conflict. When a company or a firm has competing interests that may affect the ability to be objective. In this case, it would be if we hired a company to come in and help us with the scope of work, and then we allowed them to bid on that scope of work. That is an unfair competitive advantage, and that is not allowed. It's critical to be fair, transparent, and trustworthy. We must always be in full compliance with local, federal, and state regulations, and most importantly, maintain the public trust. The county has a code of silence. The code of silence is a critical component maintaining integrity, fairness, and transparency in the public procurement process. The code of silence is a mandated communication restriction. Vendors or firms are not allowed to communicate with public officials or any county employees during a solicitation from the time we advertise it until we issue the award. If there is questions from the vendor, then they are to get with the procurement analyst that's been assigned to the project. They will get the answers, and then they will issue an addendum so it goes out to every vendor or firm who is interested in submitting a bid. We are to ensure that we have fair and open competition. Only a committee member can discuss, the only time a committee member can discuss the proposals is during an evaluation committee meeting, which is a public meeting, and it has been advertised and it is held in the sunshine. Why is the public procurement process important? It is to avoid headlines like these. The procurement process is not just a checklist. It's a critical safeguard ensuring accountability, protects taxpayers' dollars, and keeps the focus where it belongs, delivering value to the public. Local Vendor Preference Program. The Local Vendor Preference Program is designed to support and promote local Lee County businesses. In order to be considered a local vendor, you must have a physical address within Lee County. You must have at least 2 full-time employees. Also, a local business tax receipt issued 1 year prior to the bid opening. This is how it works. If you have an invitation to bid, you have a non-local vendor who is the lowest bidder. And then you have a local vendor who is within 3% of that non-local vendor. The award can go to the local vendor. If we're issuing a request for a proposal, the local vendor will receive 5-point preference out of the 100 points that will be assigned. The Local Vendor Preference Program is a strategic tool to keep public dollars in the community, encourage local job growth, and to foster local economy while maintaining fairness and competition in the procurement process. What is in the board's control? The board can establish monetary limits for procurement thresholds. And this is only if we're using local dollars. This would not apply if we're using state or federal dollars or commingled funds. But if we're using strictly local funds, the board can set the thresholds. You can establish the local vendor preference program, which you have done. If you would like to make changes to that, you can. The board establishes exemptions from procurement. Exemptions that we currently have are like travel, interlocal agreements, memberships, medications. The board can, if there's a project going on that it needs to have a quick turnaround and it doesn't conflict with any state or federal requirements, then the board could do it as an exemption. Timelines for advertising. These are the current timelines that we use for advertising our public projects. If the board would like to change those or need to change them on a case-by-case basis, they can do that, as long as it does not conflict with state and federal regulations. Since Hurricane Irma, we have implemented several key improvements to enhance our operational efficiency and disaster responses. The county now has several pre-positioned contracts. These are FEMA-approved contracts that we would get reimbursed from when we have a disaster. We have several of them now in place. We've aligned our local thresholds with the with FEMA thresholds for our formal solicitations. FEMA has several requirements, not just FEMA, but federal has several requirements that they have whenever we do procurement for them. We have to document how we've done the procurement, why we did the procurement the way we did it. So we took all of that information and we put them into several uniformed forms. So as long as we complete those forms, we're meeting the requirements that FEMA or any federal regulations want, or federal agency would like us to do. So that has helped improve on our process. All projects are now tracked using Smartsheet. This ensures a greater transparency and accountability. Additionally, we've developed an online request to initiate system along with a form. This assists the departments in submitting projects to us, and it also has it so that we can respond faster to the requests. We've also established some training. Procurement 101 is basically explaining why we need procurement and why it's important. Another one that we started this year was the federal procurement process for major emergencies and disaster-related incidents. This explains to the departments, and these are all for county employees, these explains to the employees how to fill out all that paperwork that we need. It explains to them when we have to do a formal solicitation or when we need quotes. So this program, we started this class this year, has been very successful. And of course, we have our evaluation committee member training. This is for any member who's going to be serving on an evaluation committee. This is the do's and don'ts of being on a committee. We are currently working on several future training. We're hoping to have this done by the end of next year. These will also be all for county employees to help guide them through the procurement process. That concludes my presentation, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Questions?
Thank you, Mary. Good
You're
job.
welcome.
Questions? Any questions for Mary? That was a great presentation. Appreciate the clarity. Certainly learned a few things today. Anybody else have any comments? Sure.
Sure. I did a couple of questions. In our informal bid process, when you say 3 or 1, 3 votes, 2 quotes, can you describe that process and do it submitted in a sealed envelope or with a bid opening?
For the informal process, it's not sealed bids. That is going out and getting 3 quotes or more. In most cases, when we call it an informal, that's where we've actually had to advertise it in the newspaper because the statute requires us to do that. But most of those are us just going out and contacting 3 vendors and getting quotes from them.
Okay, so I just had this experience in my own business, not here, but elsewhere, but if you don't have a sealed bid or you don't have a deadline, timeline, opening deadline process, how do you guarantee the integrity of the bids or information being shared with somebody?
If we're doing a formal solicitation, then there is a deadline and they are sealed. But with the quotes, we are entrusting our employees that they have the integrity to do this. And we do verify everything that goes through. There's nothing that the departments do that doesn't go through our office.
Okay. So on an informal quote, you wouldn't say the bids are due next Friday and somebody else could turn in a bid the following Tuesday and be the low bidder. How would you protect
Now, we do give a deadline when they have to be in, but they're not necessarily sealed. But we do give a deadline for them to be in. And if they don't meet that deadline, then it would not be accepted.
Sometimes there can be gaps in the system like that. You know, in my experience. So I'm glad to hear that we're protecting ourselves from that fairness and making sure that we have everybody's on a level playing field. Let's see here. So the other thing I wanted to ask you about was on low bid cancellations, what is a material deviation definition? How would that be defined to let somebody withdraw their bid after the fact?
What we do is if we find that they are indeed very low, we call them in and we meet with them to see if they can do it for that price. And if they can't, then we do allow them to withdraw. And the reason we allow them to withdraw is because if they did not bid enough, then they're not going to make money and they're going to nickel and dime us. Or the project's not going to be successful because they're not making any money on it. So we feel it's in the county's best interest to let them withdraw.
So for a qualified bidder, they have to submit all of the paperwork,
Yes.
all their qualifications, all of the contracts. I mean, they have to sign off about a dozen different documents for us
Yes.
to consider that they've determined that their bid is what they want it to be and that they're qualified to submit it. I'm just trying to understand if somebody comes in 70% of the pack, let's say they're the low bidder, which I've often seen in my experience. Sometimes it's been me and sometimes it's been somebody else. But they had to honor their bid. They put up a bond. They had to guarantee their bid when they came into it. So just because somebody sees that they're the low bid, I would like to see us strengthen our buyer protections to hold them accountable under those circumstances. And if there's obviously just a major mistake, I'm not trying to put somebody out of business, but at the same time, they should take responsibility for their bids and their contract and their signatures on that. And I would like to see us strengthen those.
Most cases, they do honor their bid. The only time they don't honor their bid is if we see a large discrepancy. That's when we actually would allow them. But if there is not that big if there's a very small discrepancy, then they're required to hold their bid. It's only when there's a very large discrepancy do we allow them to relook at their bid and withdraw.
Again, one bidder could bid it for cost plus 2%, and one could bid cost plus 30. It doesn't mean they made a mistake. I would like to see us get the best value for our dollar possible and see them held accountable for what they signed for. Because if you go through a formal process and put up a bond, when you sign that bond what you're guaranteeing with your bid. And I'd like to see us be a little tighter on that.
Well, we could pull on their bid bonds if that's what the county desires. We have not done that in the past.
Mr. Chair. If you can you explain go deeper into the explanation of how we bring in the vendor if they're low? Go through that process, because we did have one recently where a vendor came in low and guaranteed that at least they told us, yes, we can do this. So can you just make the commissioner feel better that what the process is, how we do that? Because there are some successes and there are reasons why we would bag out when the vendor may have missed something. Can you just go in a little bit more explanation on that, please?
Whenever we see a bid, and if there's only like a 10% difference or even a 20% difference, then we wouldn't even question it. But when we're seeing, a 30, 40, 50% difference, then we actually will call in the vendor. After we've looked at it, we typically have an estimate from our engineer. We will compare it to our estimate from our engineer. We'll compare their bid, and we'll also look at the other bids that we received. Then we call in that vendor, and we ask them if they understand the scope of work. Was there something in the scope of work that they missed? We don't tell them what the other bidders were. We just tell them there was a difference in the price.
You don't disclose?
Oh, no, absolutely not. They do not know what the other bidders have bid.
Doesn't that get posted online when you have the...
We don't post it. If it's requested from us, we have to turn it over, but we do not post them.
Okay.
We do have to read them aloud, but if they didn't attend the bid opening, then the price is not out there. Once we've called them, and we just recently had a project, there was over $1 million difference between the low and the next one. So that gave us concern. We called in the low bidder and he said, I'm doing a job right across the street. My equipment's already here. We have no problem doing that for the price that we bid it. We did have one that was like a 70% difference. And we called in the guy or the vendor, and we asked them, and when he went back and reviewed his bid, his estimator messed up big time. And there was no way he could do it for the price that he bid it.
He was off 70%.
He was off 70%. So we allowed him to withdraw that.
Okay, again, I want to make sure that we're negotiating the best value, and they should honor their bid if it was, some people take work for different reasons.
Yes, and we only check when there's a large difference. If there's not a large difference, then we hold them to their bid.
Can we talk about the RFP process where you have a pool of
Yes.
potential vendors? I think one of them that we have with engineering professional services, somewhere in that category, we have 26 different vendors.
34.
All right.
We received 65.
I thought 26 was a lot. So.
But we received 65. They were reviewed, and they narrowed it down to 34.
Okay. So when would we put that out to a formal bid versus a single bid? What is our process?
Well, if they go on a continuing service contract, that was the formal solicitation. That's where we put the 34 on. They're pre-qualified to get work with the county as long as the construction project is under the 7.7 million. We review those 34 that's in that library, and they have to pick the most qualified out of that 34 to do the project. It's all based on qualifications. We're not allowed to get pricing because it's in engineering services. And then once they pick the most qualified out of the 34, then we go into negotiations with them, and then that's brought before the board for approval.
Okay. I guess my question or point to that part of the question is, I wish there was a way.
Maybe it's a formal solicitation. Maybe we lower the dollar amount that requires a formal bid, but to see some shortlisted competition
In those contracts versus someone from a single department just going, I think Johnson Engineering should get this job, or Baracco should get this job, and both firms I value highly. I'm using two good examples of firms, but is there a way to, again, for more of a competitive process, that we could make sure that we're getting the different perspectives or values for that project, that where they're fighting for the job a little bit more so than being chosen?
You can always make it more restrictive, but that's state statute driven, because it's 287.055 is for engineers and architects. Right now, with us using that type of contract, you save at least 6 months on any project you do. If we go to where we're bidding out each and every project, then you got 6 months for your solicitation for the design, and then you've got another 4 months for construction. That's just in bidding processes. Where if we use the continuing service contract and it's under the 7.7, we can do a supplemental task order for that engineering who's already been procured. We can have that done. If it requires board approval, it takes us about 5 weeks to get it to the board from the time we get it. So you can start your design within 5 weeks. And then if we're using a construction manager at risk off of that same list, they start at the same time because they're going to start reviewing as the design goes along. They're going to review it.
Sure.
And then as soon as that's done, they have to bid out the disciplines. Once they have that done, they present the county with a guaranteed maximum price. So you're now looking at what could have been 10 additional months, we can do in a couple months.
Okay. So, again, I'm not trying to take up all the airtime here. Sometimes we don't have the money or access to the money right now. Some of these projects we've looked at for like the Maritime Park, we can't access money for a year and a half, or we may not have that. So hurrying to get the process done faster may or may not be, the funds might not be able to be utilized for some period of time. Are we looking at the delta between access to starting the project to see which method might be?
We can't go under contract until you have the money. We legally can't contract until you have the funds. Or you have it budgeted where it's going to be over multi-years. But we have to have the money before we can contract. So if I know my construction isn't going to start for a year and a half, I'm not going to go into contract with them until just before that time frame for the money to be available for them.
All right, well, then I assume you time it to be as close to
Yes.
funding ready as possible for those choices is kind of
Yes.
where I was going with this. Because you can't hold a bid for a year and a half if the
Correct.
grant isn't going to let us have the money. That wouldn't be fair to the
That is correct.
vendor either. So I'm trying to see where those decision trigger points are, because if you hurry up to get on the slow train, you know, that's not necessarily making the finish line more productive.
But an example of that would be Big Carlos. They actually took Big Carlos, we brought it to the board for the first time in 2016. It had already been working on getting it ready to present to the board for under the budget hearings. Since 2016, through different steps, we've brought it back to the board 10 times for the board to approve different things. They approved it in the budget. They approved the PD&E. They had to approve the design contract. They had to approve the construction contract. I believe we even had a meeting on whether you wanted it to be a drawbridge or the high span. So and we didn't have all the money for that up front. So there's a planning process that you go through, and as we get the money, we did the P&E, and then we got the design, we did the design. So it's a very long, drawn-out process, and that's on a large project. Your smaller projects might not be as complex, but we have to ensure that the funds are going to be available.
Okay, and please don't let any of my questions
Oh, no,
imply
no,
that
no.
anybody's not doing 110%
No.
yeoman's A+ job around here. I'm just trying to find ways that we can be more effective and more efficient with how we spend our money, right?
Yes, my world's very complicated, so I'm questioned all the time. I do not mind.
I know, you're always very helpful whenever I call you, but I'll take a break if anybody else has any other questions or follow-up.
So, Mary, it's fair to say that one of your challenges is obviously expediting a project and trying to do that, and sometimes waiting is going to just run to further delays, and that's one of the balances you have to go through?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Thank you. I thought I
You're welcome.
got that well.